Te whakarongo mai koe ki te rangi o Aotearoa. This is Checkpoint on RNZ National. I'm Lisa Owen. Haere ake nei. Straight to COVID alert level 4 if Delta comes calling. That's the stark warning from the COVID minister. And experts predict we're in the firing line for a New South Wales-style outbreak over the coming months. So what is the plan? The COVID response minister is live. The company behind a COVID-infected freighter admits it doesn't regularly test its crews for the virus. And there appears to be a tin shed approach to COVID at a busy Auckland marina where overseas shipping crews are quietly being ferried to boats anchored offshore. High-profile MMA fighters want tougher penalties for the so-called coward punch. And the art of recycling. National scores a Green Party cast-off.
RNZ News at 5 o'clock. Kia ora, ko Anna Thomas tēnei. The government's warning it will take a swift and severe approach to community cases of COVID-19 in future and move quickly to alert level 4. It comes as a long-awaited report into reopening the border states New Zealand is likely to experience an outbreak of the Delta variant similar to Sydney's. COVID-19 Response Minister Chris Hipkins says New Zealand's taking lessons from Australia about how to stop the Delta variant gaining a foothold here. He says the government wants to avoid spending drawn-out periods in lockdown.
It's certainly more likely that our response is likely to be swift and severe in the event that we were to see a case emerge in the community.
Chris Hipkins says even really good contact tracing has been shown to be insufficient to properly contain an outbreak. A specialist in emergency medicine says without more intensive care nurses, the health system will be overrun in even a modest outbreak of the COVID-19 Delta variant. Sir David Skegg's report on reopening the border says this country has the second fewest intensive care beds per capita in the OECD. College of Intensive Care Medicine Chair and Heart Hospital ICU Director Andrew Stapleton says the real pinch point is the lack of ICU nurses.
One thing that would be useful was to make sure that we hold on to the staff that we have got, many of whom come from abroad, and reducing bureaucratic barriers such as visas to these staff having to leave the country. That would be a quick win.
Dr Stapleton says he understands the government is looking to change visa rules to help foreign nurses stay. After saying it felt like the scapegoat for Monday's power crisis, Genesis says today's meeting with the Energy Minister was constructive. The gas and electricity generator met with Megan Woods to discuss the major power blackouts that plunged thousands into darkness on Monday night. Its Chief Executive Mark England says they agreed the industry would ensure the situation is not repeated. Meanwhile, Waikato power company Well Networks says Transpower asked it to turn off 20% of its electricity, well above the national rate. Its Chief Executive Garth Dibley says the national grid operator later confirmed it had got the numbers wrong. Well shut off power to over 17,000 customers in Hamilton. Transpower is required to reduce load evenly across all its customers. UFC middleweight champion Israel Adesanya is joining the call for changes to the law for so-called coward punching. Ofahe Mauni Falau has been sentenced to 6 months home detention after pleading guilty to 2 charges of assault with intent to injure. He attacked MMA fighter Fao Vake in Auckland in May. Mr Vake later died in hospital of head injuries. At a press conference, Adesanya says the law isn't tough enough.
If you run behind someone and punch them, you know what you're trying to do. But there's no deterrent.
3 others who have interim name suppression have pleaded not guilty to the attack on Mr Vake, including one charged with manslaughter. The Sports Minister, Grant Robertson, says the comments made by Hurricanes board member Troy Bowker are appalling. The businessman reacted angrily on Twitter to Sir Ian Taylor reposting a cartoon celebrating New Zealand's success on the water at the Olympics. He accused Sir Ian of, quote, sucking up to the left-loving Maori agenda on a LinkedIn post. Hurricanes Rugby says it can't control the views of Mr Bowker, one of its part owners. Grant Robertson was asked whether it's appropriate for him to stay on.
Personally, I think Mr Bowker needs to consider that. It's not actually my responsibility because I have no role in that, but I think his comments were appalling.
And Grant Robertson says the fact Mr Bowker sits on the board because of his ownership stake could make it difficult to remove him. It's 5:04. To sport, former New Zealand cricketer Chris Cairns is now in a serious but stable condition in a Sydney hospital after reportedly suffering from a major heart problem in Canberra last week. A spokesperson for St Vincent's Hospital says Cairns was transferred to there yesterday and remains in intensive care. Felicity Reid reports.
Cairns, one of the best all-rounders of his era, reportedly suffered an aortic dissection, which is a tear in the body's main artery, last week. He played 62 tests, 215 one-day internationals and 2 T20 matches for New Zealand between 1989 and 2006. However, after retiring from the game, he was the subject of match-fixing allegations. Cairns denied any wrongdoing and fought several legal battles to clear his name. He won a libel case against former Indian Premier League chairman late Modi in 2012, and in 2015 he was cleared of perjury in relation to the libel case after being charged by Britain's Crown Prosecution Service.
Lionel Messi has signed a 2-year contract with Paris Saint-Germain after leaving Barcelona. Messi left Barcelona, the only club he's played for, because they were unable to afford a new deal under La Liga's salary cap rules. French footballer and former PSG player David Ginola says while Messi is undoubtedly one of the greatest players of all time, he's not sure whether he'll be able to adjust to a new club at the age of 34.
To start again in another club, another language, different tradition, different everything when you reach 34, I think it would be the challenge for Messi.
And that's the news.
Widening our vaccine booster gap.
What's emerged overseas that if you extend the gap to between 6 and 10 weeks, there may be an enhanced immune response.
Pinning down our power problems.
Generation wasn't tight on Monday night. That wasn't the issue. Do we actually need to change the way this market has been set up?
And opening up our borders.
I'm hoping that people from lots of countries who've been tested at the airport could avoid MIQ. That's certainly the advice of our group.
All change. Morning reports, weekdays from 6 on RNZ National.
And now the short forecast from Met Service until midnight. Tomorrow from Northland to Taranaki, also Coromandel in the central high country. Partly cloudy with isolated showers. Bay of Plenty in Gisborne to Wairirapa. Generally fine, but isolated showers. Whanganui to Wellington, mainly fine. However, the odd shower about Whanganui and Manawatu tomorrow, spreading elsewhere in the evening. For Nelson, Marlborough and Canterbury, fine today. Becoming cloudy tomorrow with heavy rain about the main divide and scattered falls elsewhere from the evening, and northwest gales about the Canterbury high country. For Buller and Westland, cloudy with a few showers today, heavy rain spreading north tomorrow. For Otago and Southland, fine, but cloudy tomorrow with rain for a time late afternoon or evening and northwest gales in exposed places. For Fiordland, periods of rain, heavy for a time tomorrow with northwest gales. And for the Chatham Islands, fine spells, a few showers, clearing tomorrow morning. RNZ National, it is 5:07 and you're listening to Checkpoint with Lisa Owen.
Kia ora rā. Tēnā koutou katoa, no mai haere mai ki Checkpoint I tēnei rā, ko Lisa Owen tēnei. Brace for impact. It's likely New Zealand will escalate straight to a short, sharp level 4 lockdown should any new community cases of COVID-19 emerge. Chris Hipkins issued the stark warning this afternoon. At about the same time, Sydney announced another 344 community cases today in its runaway Delta cluster, plus 2 more deaths overnight. Earlier, our government's own COVID health advisory group warned that New Zealand is likely to experience an outbreak similar to the New South Wales one over the coming months. And it's entirely possible the highly contagious Delta strain may be displaced by an even more transmissible variant by the end of this year. With one eye on the outbreak across the ditch and the gloomy outlook from his own advisors, Minister Hipkins warned this is not over and everyone should have a plan. The Minister joins me now. Minister, why now for this dire warning? What prompted it?
Obviously, we've been watching what's happening in Australia very closely. It shows, the approaches of the different Australian states show both how Delta can be
contained and how it can't be. New South Wales have had very good contact tracing in the past, as we do here in New Zealand. It hasn't been able to contain the Delta variant, and once it gets away, it's very, very hard to get it back in the box, as they're seeing in New South Wales. On the other hand, other Australian states have been able to react very quickly with short, sharp lockdowns, and the result is that they've been able to bring it under control more quickly. So I think it's important that New Zealanders know that we're following what's happening around the world, and that we actually foreshadow to them in advance what's likely to happen here if we have to deal with an outbreak here.
What would level 4 under a Delta outbreak look like? Would it be more restrictive than the lockdown we've previously experienced?
Our level 4 restrictions are already some of the most severe in the world in terms of what people can and can't do. There would be some changes. Mask use, for example, was not something that was even considered back last time we went through this process early last year. We've learned a lot about COVID-19 since then, and mask use would likely be much more widely used at higher alert levels than ever before.
Given how transmissible the Delta strain is, what would it take? Just one case for you to shut us down?
Look, everything it depends on the circumstances. How many people have the case been into contact with? Where have they been? Could it be?
You would have done scenarios, Minister, I'm picking, and I'm sorry to interrupt, but describe to me the scenario that you would have been presented with that would prompt a lockdown.
Oh, there are multiple different scenarios. If we were talking about someone who had made it through the border but had very limited contact with others, then we may be able to use contact tracing in order to isolate that. On the other hand, if we saw cases starting to pop up in the community where the links weren't clear, I think you can expect to see us move very, very quickly in that circumstance.
Can our contact tracing system actually keep up with the Delta cluster? What is the maximum number of cases we could trace in a single day?
I think the issue is as long as you get ahead of it very quickly, then yes, contact tracing can help you get out of it. One of the challenges is at the beginning of an outbreak, that's actually the critical time. What we saw in New South Wales was at the beginning of the outbreak, contact tracing just couldn't keep up. It couldn't get ahead of it. I think what we know is if you can do a short, sharp lockdown at the beginning, it gives your contact tracers time to get ahead of it, and then that system can work very, very well. And other Australian states have shown that.
The continuous improvement report that you got on the 4th of June said that our contact tracing system would struggle to trace 100 to 200 cases a day for a prolonged period. If we're talking about a New South Wales-style outbreak, then that's days and days of 100 to 200 to 300 plus cases. Is our contact tracing system up to scratch as it stands right now?
Yes, it is a good system, but any system is going to struggle with a huge caseload. And so what we want to do is, by using restrictions early in an outbreak, we actually reduce the number of cases that would need to be contact traced. Now, to put that into context, when we talk about contact tracing, we can be talking about several different things. In the early phase of a contact tracing process, as we saw with the most recent example in Wellington, we were dealing with one case and we contact traced sort of about 2,500 people. You wouldn't do that if you were dealing with, potentially hundreds of cases a day. You'd be down to dealing with their most immediate contacts only, which is what the system was originally designed to do. So you do go through different phases of contact tracing depending on where you're at in terms of the overall number of cases you're dealing with.
And I do appreciate that, Minister, but this improvement report said to you that you need to be aware of what your maximum capacity is. So what is it?
The maximum capacity can surge. It will require us bringing in extra people.
What is it, please?
Several hundred at a time, but it would involve us bringing extra people in.
So several hundred is a big scope, Minister. Can you please give me the number? Because they said you needed a number and you needed to articulate that number and have a system that could, increase capacity. What is the number?
Oh, look, I don't have the latest capacity report sitting right in front of me at the moment. I can certainly get that and I can certainly give that information out. I just don't have it in front of me. But it is in several hundred cases a day that we would be able to manage.
This report also suggested that you stress test an aggressive approach to an outbreak. So have you run exercises assuming that we have Delta in the community, and how have we held up in that stress testing?
Well, in fact, we did a stress test live real time with what we did in Wellington, where we had one case. We really pushed the system to its absolute limit. We contact traced over 2,500 people, and that system worked very effectively. The testing worked very effectively.
But is that the only stress testing that you've done, an actual real-life example? Because, again, this report suggested you run a variety of scenarios, including outbreaks in schools and other places. So have you done those exercises as recommended?
A variety of different exercises have been done. Obviously, there are always more potential exercises you could do. The possibilities here, unfortunately, are unlimited. And so, yes, we do try and stress test the system. It's not always possible to run through every possible scenario, though.
Minister, what's more important, widening the gap between vaccination to get better protection or getting the maximum number of people vaccinated as soon as possible, fully vaccinated as soon as possible? Which of those is more important?
It's a balance between the two, and we're going to be talking a little bit more about this tomorrow. The government has been considering whether we extend the gap between the doses, based on the fact that we are seeing emerging and increasing evidence internationally that a slightly bigger gap between doses actually increases the body's immune system response, which actually can be quite helpful. So we're getting more evidence internationally about that. So we have been considering that.
So can you call that now? Which is more important?
It's both. We still want to get people fully vaccinated as quickly as we can, but as we'll set out tomorrow, there is emerging evidence that actually getting the maximum protection can be enhanced with a slightly larger gap.
Various expert advisors have again reiterated the need to get the maximum number of people who vaccinated, right? So 12 to 15-year-olds, it seems increasingly clear that you will need to vaccinate them. When are you going to greenlight that?
So we've had all of these things are interlinked, including the gap between doses and everything. We've had the advice from MedSafe. We've had further advice from Health. I imagine Cabinet will make a decision on the 12 to 15-year-olds within the next few weeks. Continuing to work our way down through the age brackets, it will still be a wee while before we get to the 12 to 15-year-olds. But I believe that Cabinet will make a decision on that in the next few weeks.
Are you delaying because of vaccine availability?
No, not at all.
Because the thing is, you're telling us and the experts are telling us, matter of time before Delta gets here, and it's a hard thing to shut down. So don't we want to get our 12 to 15-year-olds in the queue and vaccinated ASAP?
Oh, look, we want to get as many people vaccinated as quickly as we can. System's pumping now. I think we did 45,000 or 46,000 doses yesterday alone. We are working as fast as we can to get vaccines into the arms of people, including those who are currently eligible. There's still a lot of them that we've got to work our way through. Okay,
so the advice you've had about potential easing up of border restrictions, it talks about doing this when the vaccination program is complete. Can you tell me what your definition of complete is?
What we've said is that we will make sure everybody in New Zealand has the opportunity to have a vaccine, or to have the current course of vaccines, the 2 Pfizer vaccines, by the end of this year. What we don't yet know is whether a third booster shot might be required, which would be next year. So there's still some question marks there, but certainly our goal remains everybody who is eligible, so there will still likely be some age restrictions by the end of the year. Everybody who's eligible will have had that opportunity to have both of those doses by the end of this year.
Minister, the Trans-Tasman bubble, if it reopens, will it look the same as before?
No, I think it will look different.
How so?
Well, there may be some additional requirements. Vaccination, I think, can play a bigger role here. It may be that there are vaccine requirements put in place as part of a reopening of safe travel zones. All of those things are things that we'll work our way through. Looking at what's happening in Australia, it's still some time away.
Minister, are you favouring a Trans-Tasman bubble, quarantine-free travel, only if you are fully vaccinated?
Certainly, people being fully vaccinated is likely to be a very important part of any liberalisation of movement at the border in the future. We're still a way away from that, but we'll talk more about that tomorrow.
Appreciate your time this evening. That is Chris Hipkins, the COVID-19 Response Minister. It is 18 minutes past 5 and you're with Checkpoint on RNZ National. Kia ora rawatu mo te whakarongo mai. Thanks for listening. E haere aki nei. Coming up, a stoush over alleged racism in rugby's ranks. Ho mai o whakaro, we would love your feedback. Nō reira ānei na kaupapa mo te hōtaka nei. About this warning that Chris Hipkins gave this afternoon, telling people to be prepared, have a plan. he said, warning that potentially we would go straight to a lockdown if we get Delta in the community. Are you prepared? How so? Pātui mai, text me 2101, tweet us at Checkpoint RNZ or email checkpoint@rnz.co.nz. The mask appears to be slipping right off people's faces on buses in Auckland. Mask wearing is compulsory on public transport across the country, but it's a rule many appear to be ignoring. And those carting people around say they're finding it hard to sell the message to people on board. Our reporter Louise Tanuth and camera operator Marika Habezi hit the streets.
Whether it's the regular morning bus commute, a weekend ferry ride, or a train to the big game, there's supposed to be a mask on your face. It's a rule up and down the country, but one people seem to have a more laid-back attitude towards. We stopped by this busy bus stop near Auckland Hospital to see what they had to say about covering up.
On the bus that we came in this morning, the driver wasn't wearing a mask, but most of the people were. I think we're a bit complacent now.
Yeah,
yes.
a bit complacent.
You know, we've had so much freedom for so long that, the rules often aren't taken into account.
I feel like no one really cares about it anymore. I take the train, and on the train every morning they say that wearing masks is compulsory, so I feel like there's quite a high rate of mask wearing on the train.
I usually take the bus during the busy times, and a lot of the people have masks on, but it's kind of sad when sometimes the bus drivers themselves don't put the masks on. That's kind of frustrating, I guess.
We jumped on a bus back to the city to see for ourselves who's obeying the rules. On a lunchtime ride from the hospital to Queen Street, 3 people out of about 15 passengers weren't wearing their mask. Not all drivers have to wear them. If the bus isn't in service, they're exempt. So too are drivers who have certain health conditions. This bus driver has some strong feelings on the issue.
It varies. I'd say it's about 50%. When I'm driving, I wear the mask, so, that's all I can do, really.
Do you think many bus drivers are pretty much the same as you? They try and wear it all the time, or do you reckon some don't?
Most that I've seen are wearing the mask, yeah. Although they are quite uncomfortable and I do like taking it off.
He's given up telling people to put them on.
I have noticed some passengers have taken it on themselves to kind of be a mask police, and that hasn't worked. Yeah. It's better to just wear your own mask.
Lena is a driver for New Zealand Bus and says the situation is very frustrating.
It's not good, but we Auckland Transport, we're not forcing them, but it's for our sake for us to wear our masks, so they can wear, but they have to just to protect themselves, but they just walk in.
Auckland Transport has control over these operations. Manager of Metro Services Stacey Vanderputten says there's certainly fewer people wearing masks these days.
Compliance has dropped. So during the commuting peak, it's still pretty good. There is a high level of compliance because people are doing that in their everyday life and they're used to it. It is outside of that period, so off-peak and in the weekends where compliance levels do drop and they go to the side.
But it's not up to them to enforce the rule. That's a job for police. But transport officers working on ferries and trains do remind passengers and even hand out masks. But sometimes when they issue those reminders, they're met with pushback.
People just saying, no, I'm not going to wear it, no sort of rhyme or reason. And that has resulted in escalated sort of behaviour that has led to violence in some instances.
A spokesperson from the Ministry of Health says they're encouraged by the uptake of face covering usage, especially during Alert Level 1. And they're working with transport operators to promote face masks as one way to minimise the spread of COVID-19.
It is 22 minutes past 5. Homai o whakaro, want to know if you wear a mask on the bus? If not, why not? Text me on 2101. You're listening to Checkpoint on RNZ National. The government has quietly established a transfer zone for foreign shipping crew in a busy commercial area in Auckland. Crew are transferred from international flights or a short MIQ stay to a nondescript shed at Tamaki Marina before being ferried to ships waiting out at sea. The operation's in place despite Prime Minister Jacinda Ardern expressing concern about the continuation of some crew transfers. Our reporter Nick Trubridge and cameraman Nick Monroe have the story.
Now, just behind me is Tamaki Marine Park, and Checkpoint's learnt this is where shipping crew will be processed to be taken out to sea. They'll come here from either MIQ or straight from Auckland Airport. As for the facilities used, they'll require a deep clean, as will the boat that's used to take them out to sea. The staff here, well, some of them are now considered border workers, and they'll now require vaccination.
The processing site at Tamaki Marine Park appears relatively nondescript, comprising a shed at the top of a quiet jetty. Officials say the shed lets customs process crew under shelter and to protect their privacy. The shed's been approved despite these comments from Prime Minister Jacinda Ardern last month.
When it comes to fishing crew, two different issues here. If a fishing crew is linked to New Zealand in some way, if they are processing in New Zealand, then of course we would treat them differently. If, however, they're a foreign flagged vessel that is fishing offshore New Zealand, has no connection to New Zealand, I'm asking for Crown law advice as to whether or not we can remove their ability to recrew from New Zealand, because I see no need for us to take unnecessary risk for a foreign vessel where there is no benefit to New Zealand whatsoever.
Those comments were made after two fishermen who were driven from Auckland Airport to Taranaki last month tested positive for COVID-19. Officials dubbed the public health risk low, but 3 involved in the transfer had to isolate. Checkpoint has asked the Prime Minister's office for an update on that legal advice. In the meantime, Joint Head of Managed Isolation and Quarantine, Brigadier Rose King, told us people working in the marine park area who have had contact with the mariners are now considered border workers and have commenced the vaccination program. But officials are yet to confirm whether staff now working at this makeshift East Auckland port have been vaccinated. Otago University Professor Nick Wilson says it doesn't look great.
It's definitely far, far from ideal. It's another sign that New Zealand's not really taking the situation with the new Delta variant at the appropriate, extremely high level of rigour. And it's very disappointing that these problems keep being failed to be really properly addressed.
Professor Wilson says the transfer process at Tamaki Marine Park must be carried out meticulously to avoid any risk of transmission.
The ideal is to have good ventilation at all points in the movement from the aircraft to right until they leave New Zealand on a boat, but also that there's good and highly consistent wearing of masks by the crew members and all the border staff interacting with them. But really, I mean, the ideal is also to, as well as those precautions, to add in a requirement for vaccination before they leave their source country.
Another issue is location. Tamaki Marine Park is surrounded by a bustling commercial area. The marina itself is worked by many staff.
Just like having hotels in the centre of the Auckland business centre used for quarantine. I mean, this is still so far from the ideal of having quarantine facilities that are built outside a city, such as Howard Springs in Australia, that are all separate units. I mean, we know how transmissible the Delta virus is.
Checkpoint has been told workers at nearby businesses and at the site itself have not been vaccinated or contacted about vaccinations. Brigadier Rose King says the jetty being used is fenced off from the public and the transfer boat from jetty to ship will operate in accordance with infection prevention and control protocols.
We asked the operations manager of Tamaki Marine Park whether staff there had been vaccinated. He declined to comment. In a statement, the Ministry of Health says it's been visiting ports around the country to discuss the amended vaccinations order. It didn't tell us how many workers at this specific location have been vaccinated or whether they've been vaccinated at all. The ministry says 90% of those on the border worker testing register have had at least one dose of the vaccine. And Checkpoint understands legal advice sought by the Prime Minister's office on banning foreign fishing ships flying here to board vessels with no ties to New Zealand is imminent. Recovering meth addicts in the far north are begging the government to boost local resources to help kick the drug. Former users from across the Motu have been visiting Kaitaia in a push to support the community, where locals say it is easier to get P than it is to get pot. Anei te kai reporter Anita Blake person.
Speaking in front of her Kaitaia community, Hayley Fryer has something to celebrate.
I don't know how and I don't know why, but today I'm, just almost 3.5 years clean. And
It's a massive win for Hayley, standing alongside other members of support group the NTP Ministry. They're here to share their stories and their struggles with methamphetamine or P. Kaitaia is reported to have some of the highest rates of P in the country, with wastewater testing revealing its use right across the week. Dozens of people have turned out for the hui, with Hayley revealing the tipping point she reached in 2018 after using the drug since she was a teenager.
I found myself in a jail cell. My kids were with their grandmother and I had no idea when I was going to see them again. My baby was only 5 months old, she was still breastfeeding, and when it came to my bail hearing, the judge told me that I was an undue risk to the community and denied me bail.
It's a situation she's determined others shouldn't find themselves in, but it's no easy battle.
It's easier to get meth up here than it is to get pot, and that's pretty bad.
Former users, cooks and dealers turned out for this week's kōrero, which was organised by the NTP Ministry. The group's online support has grown massively in recent years, with 8,000 Facebook members sharing stories of their recovery. This week, members travelled from as far as Wellington to spread their message in the north. Speaking in front of their official meth-fighting bus, Ministry founder and former Black Power President Brendan Warne says he's determined to put right the damage he's caused in the past.
The country's getting worse and worse, the prices are getting cheaper. Other countries are seeing us as a big market. We pay more than most other countries will. In England, it's a gutter drug. They'd rather do cocaine. New Zealand is one of the biggest markets. We pay the most. People seem to love it. It's something about it. It's a deceitful drug that makes us feel better. It lies to us.
Part of the drug's proliferation is that it's cheap. Warren reckons it costs $1,000 to make a kilo in Mexico, and it's marked up hundreds of thousands of dollars when it gets here. Hayley says kicking the habit in Kaitaia is particularly hard.
It's everywhere, there's no avoiding it, like I had somebody turn up to my house a few nights ago asking me if I wanted to smoke some. It's 6 o'clock at night and my kids are in bed and I hear this knock, knock, knock on the window and I'm like, who's this? And I poke my head out and they're like, oh, do you want a sesh? It's like, I don't smoke that and I haven't smoked it in years, but it's still right there on my doorstep.
She's among a chorus of people in the far north who want more support services.
I think we need a big residential rehab, a big one. Not one that's just got 12 or 13 beds because, the wait list for that would just be astronomical.
While there is a residential treatment facility available in Ngātaki, a 45-minute drive away, the region's only detox facility is in Dargaville, nearly 2.5 hours south. Roberta Kaior is the whānau coach at Rongapai House, a community trust working with Hayley and other Kaitaia whānau who need support. She says existing services, like so many across the country, are already overloaded.
We're like the poor cousin. We're far away from those main resource areas like Auckland, like Wellington, Whangarei even. We're still far away. We don't have a detox up here. We don't have a rehab up here. Our closest one is in Kawakawa. There is a service-led one up in Ngātaki in the far north, but Kaitaia itself is a big community. We're actually the hub of the far north, so we do lack those resources.
In a statement, Northland's DHB manager for addiction and mental health, Ian McKenzie, says detox is only part of a treatment plan and community services are key for local support. He says the DHB, with provincial growth funding, invested in many of those services last year, including more than $1 million for Hope House in Ngātaki, and notes anyone can self-refer to Te Ara Oranga, the methamphetamine harm reduction initiative that was launched in 2017. But Hayley Fryer says there's more problem than there is help, and she's pushing for more people with lived experience to share their stories.
Not everybody fits in one box. There's not one size fits all for recovering from your addictions, and what might work for one person isn't necessarily going to work for the next person.
But when they do, Hayley says it's pretty incredible.
Life can be miraculous if you just get off the crack.
A message she hopes many more suffering from the scourge of P will hear.
Interior decorating has proved contentious at Parliament today, with the National Party decrying the relocation of a Winston Churchill portrait as deeply offensive. The Greens say the opposition should focus on issues that matter, but the controversy has now attracted comment from outside the building, with Winston Peters weighing in. Our Deputy Political Editor, Craig McCulloch, has the story.
We shall fight on the beaches.
To many, he's a war hero, the greatest Briton of the last century. But Winston Churchill is also a lightning rod for controversy.
We shall never surrender.
The former British Prime Minister has a checkered legacy. He led his country through the Second World War. But Winston Churchill also held deeply racist views and is accused of causing the Bengal famine, which killed up to 3 million people. In recent years, protesters abroad have defaced his statue. Now the firestorm has reached New Zealand shores.
Definitely not my favourite painting.
Not a great fit for the Green Party kaupapa.
Yeah.
A portrait of the man has long hung in a public area on Parliament's second floor. The Greens recently moved into nearby offices and asked to redecorate.
We're loving that we're going to put a tangata whenua piece of art up there, which is exactly the fit for the Green Party that we want.
The requests prompted fury from the opposition. Judith Collins says she's disgusted. So much so, National has put up its hand to take the painting on its floor.
I just think it's outrageous. I mean, they're so disrespectful. This was a person who was one of the very few politicians who had the courage to stand up against Nazism when so many other people were happy to give in to it.
Do they really think that Winston Churchill was not one of the greatest anti-fascist leaders in history? Or maybe they believe in fascism now, who knows?
And hold up, here's a voice from the past, none other than Winston Churchill's namesake, New Zealand First's Winston Peters.
I cannot believe that a group of people could be so petty, so unparliamentary, or so lacking in historic understanding of Winston Churchill's importance to, dare I say, democracy and freedom. I think they should just grow up.
We're hanging a painting somewhere else in a building. That's the entire story. It's just a painting, no one cares.
And that sentiment from James Shaw is echoed by the Prime Minister, Jacinda Ardern.
We have a responsibility to look after New Zealanders in a massive crisis that we're facing. Frankly, who hangs on the wall at the time we do it? I don't care.
Parliament Speaker Trevor Mallard says he has no problem with the request to relocate the painting, noting the building's decorations will change over time. But he says he's not one for denying global history.
There are a number of things around here that I wouldn't have put up if I had the choice, but they've been here for a long time and I'm not into cancel culture.
A British culture war in the halls of New Zealand's Parliament. The walls may be due a refresh soon regardless. The Speaker has hinted work is underway on some portraits of New Zealand figures.
E te iwi e haere nei e a checkpoint. Are you ready if there's another lockdown, and how well prepared is our health system? Maori Trades and Training get a funding boost, and the Hurricanes fan boycotting games over a stoush over alleged racism. Homai o whakaaro, I'd love to hear from you about anything you've heard on the programme this evening. You can text us on 2101, tweet us at Checkpoint RNZ, or email checkpoint@rnz.co.nz. It is time now for the headlines. Ko Anna Anō tēnei.
Thanks, Lisa. The government is expected to announce an extension of time between COVID-19 vaccinations to 8 weeks tomorrow. The COVID-19 response minister, Chris Hipkins, says the government wants to get people fully vaccinated as quickly as possible. He says there is emerging evidence that having a larger gap between the two Pfizer shots gives better protection. And New Zealand will move quickly into alert level 4 if there is a COVID-19 outbreak in the community. A report into the reopening of the country's border predicts there will be an outbreak of the Delta variant similar to Sydney's. The COVID-19 response minister, Chris Hipkins, says the government will take a swift and severe approach. But he says we can learn lessons from Australia to stop the variant taking hold. Mr Hipkins says the government wants to avoid spending drawn-out periods in lockdown. Genesis is describing today's meeting with the Energy Minister as constructive. The gas and electricity generator has met with Megan Woods to discuss the major power blackouts that plunged thousands of households into darkness on Monday night. It has said it felt like it was being used as a scapegoat when it came to attributing blame. Chief Executive Mark England says it was agreed at the meeting that the industry would ensure the situation is not repeated. National and New Zealand First are united in their condemnation of the Greens, who have removed a painting of Winston Churchill from outside their parliamentary offices. The Greens say they just wanted another piece more appropriate to their kaupapa. But National leader Judith Collins says it's incredibly disrespectful because Winston Churchill was one of the very few politicians who had the courage to stand up to the Nazi regime. New Zealand First leader Winston Peters says he can't believe it and the Greens need to grow up. That's the news. It is 22 minutes to 6.
Kia ora e ho no mai hoki mai. If you've just tuned in, this is Checkpoint. I'm Lisa Owen. Ko taku hoa inai nei, ko Giles Beckford. Giles is live from our Wellington studio. Giles, ASB annual profit comes back with a hiss and a roar. Give us the details.
Kia ora to you, Lisa. Yes, if you needed proof that the banks are back in clover, then the ASB profit gives you some certain evidence of that. Annual profit up by 39% to $1.3 billion. Now, of course, the comparison was tainted by last year's COVID restrictions, so we take that into account. But their lending, their home lending, up by 12%. Their business lending up around 8 or 9%. Their interest rate margin, a sign of their profitability, also increasing. Last year, they put aside more than $300 for bad and doubtful debts, fearful, of course, that there would be a collapse in the housing market, businesses would go broke and the like. None of that eventuated. In fact, they actually managed to claw back some bad debts a little bit. So all in all, you have to say, here's a bank that's back to business as usual. Profits as usual. They're facing some challenges, of course, in the next month or next year or so. There's going to be rising interest rates, and that will mean there'll be some competition in the sector there, rising costs as well. And, of course, the Reserve Bank is bringing in regulations, forcing them to increase the capital that they hold. I asked Victoria Short, the chief executive, whether, in fact, it was back to the good old days when the banks just made bumper profits year after year, perhaps just casting an eye across the ditch to where her parent bank, CBA, is operating in Australia, saying, we don't think that New Zealand is necessarily out of the woods yet. Anything could happen, and we're being prepared for it. But all in all, you have to say, another sign that the banking industry is back to the good old days.
Giles, let's talk about the number of jobs being advertised, right, at a record high. But what's the deal? Is there nobody applying for them?
Well, that's the interesting one. Record high. This is from Seek, which is a big employment advertising agency. They've had for the 5th month in a row record high job adverts, which were up a couple of percent on June. 88% on last year, but that's a meaningless comparison, really, once again, because of COVID. 30% higher than 2 years ago. So there's the real measure of job market in this country. But the number of applications has actually fallen several percent, suggesting, of course, that those who want a job are generally being able to find it. It mirrors, of course, the jobs numbers that we had last week, which showed unemployment at 4%. 20-odd thousand jobs created for the quarter. Underemployment and underutilisation also falling. All in all, a really tight jobs market that seems to be offering close to full employment. Of course, another signal for the Reserve Bank that because the jobs market and the state of the jobs market is one of their key mandates, that this is an economy that's doing well. It doesn't need to stimulate it with extra low interest rates. So a sign that perhaps next week, I should say, this time next week, the Reserve Bank will have raised the cash rate by 1/4 percentage point.
Giles, shall we take a quick canter around the markets before you head off?
A little sprint. Local share market couldn't quite make up its mind. It was upsy-downsy for much of the day. Closed down 16 points, 12,748. New Zealand dollar holding pretty steady at around 70.3 US cents and 95.4 Australian.
Ka kite, Giles. That is our business editor, Giles Beckford, joining me live there from Wellington. All Black TJ Perenara says he's insulted by comments made by a Hurricanes director and owner and says the team's supporters deserve better. Businessman Troy Bowker accused animation entrepreneur Sir Ian Taylor of sucking up to the left-loving Maori agenda on a LinkedIn post. The Hurricanes are distancing themselves from the comments but can't cut ties with the man who made them. Anei te kai reporter Amani Dunlop.
The chant many will be familiar with, but as promised by some Canes fans online, many won't be chanting it anytime soon. Insulting, underlying racist, and supporters deserve better was how Hurricanes player TJ Perenara has described the comments made by one of the directors and part owner, Troy Bowker. In the halfback social media post, he said he was in conversations with other players and management and expects these conversations to continue over the coming days. Speaker of the House, Trevor Mallard, an avid Hurricanes fan and Wellington rugby stalwart, is disgusted by Bowker's comment and says he will not attend another game while the businessman is on the board.
I'm not going to go while that man is a director. I generally see about half a dozen matches a year, a couple of times, 3 times with the Hurricanes management, but I won't be doing that if there's any chance of running into that man.
Rugby commentator Ken Laban says it is absolutely unacceptable and Hurricanes need to be seen to do something about it.
Well, so I can understand the Hurricanes being protective of that money, but equally they are now in the opportunity for them to show some leadership of whether or not this is acceptable behaviour from an organisation that has a large representation of Māori and Pasifika players.
There have been repeated interview requests to the Hurricanes today. Yesterday, the franchise chair, Ian Potter, says it doesn't support the remarks in question. But he says, as a part owner of the Hurricanes, Mr Bowker is entitled to a director's role and consequently the club is not in a position to control his opinions. RNZ understands the board has their regular meeting tomorrow, in which this will no doubt be on the agenda. This afternoon, New Zealand Rugby released a statement on the matter and says it is in communication with the Hurricanes.
The comments made by Troy Bowker are not supported by New Zealand Rugby in any way and are not reflective of the values of our organisation and the aspiration we have for our game across the country. Although we have no jurisdiction over the makeup of our Super Rugby club boards, we are in dialogue with the Hurricanes to provide support as required.
RNZ has approached Troy Bowker for comment, but yesterday said he stood by all his comments. He's backed that up with another comment online. Asked by someone if he regretted his comments, he replied that he is, quote, rich as and doesn't care what the left-wing losers think. The website for his company, Kaniwi Limited, is down and the phone number is not working.
It is 5:45. I'm Lisa Owen and you're with Checkpoint on RNZ National. He muriaki na pita pita kōrero. After the news at 6, the Minister warns COVID ain't over yet, so what should happen with our borders? Doctors fear New Zealand's health system could quickly collapse in the event of an outbreak of the Delta variant of COVID-19. The COVID-19 response minister has warned the country would go straight to a level 4 lockdown if Delta creeps across the border. An expert report says it's a matter of when, not if, and it warns the health system is poorly resourced to deal with it. Hamish Cardwell filed this report.
New Zealand could be staring down the barrel of a New South Wales-style outbreak by the end of the year. A new Government Commission report is warning the health system needs to get ready for it. College of General Practitioners Medical Director Dr Brian Betty says it would overwhelm the healthcare system very quickly.
We couldn't afford a situation in New Zealand to have Delta out of control in the community because it would risk collapsing or compromising our health system, and that's the critical point with a potential COVID outbreak.
Sir David Skegg's report says New Zealand has the second fewest number of intensive care beds per capita in the OECD. Hutt Hospital ICU Director Dr Andrew Stapleton says there are simply not enough beds to cope.
Because hospitals are ageing and because our resilience to a pandemic situation is poor because of the design of our elderly hospitals with poor ventilation of wards, inadequate numbers of negative pressure rooms.
He says on a normal day, only about 25 of the roughly 220 ICU beds are free. Dr Stapleton says New Zealand's ICU capacity is more like India's, where hospitals were overrun, and it needs to be doubled to deal with the ongoing effects of COVID. He says the real pinch point is the lack of ICU nurses.
One thing that would be useful was to make sure that we hold on to the staff that we have got, many of whom come from abroad, and reducing bureaucratic barriers such as visas to these staff having to leave the country. That would be a quick win.
Director General of Health Ashley Bloomfield says additional nurses have been trained to help out in ICU since the pandemic.
All DHBs were required to train up additional nursing staff to be able to do that. As part of going back to district health boards to look at their readiness and preparation in the light of the Delta variant, they will have another look at that as well, just to make sure that is still current.
According to today's report, the border will remain firmly shut for the foreseeable future. Dr Brian Betty says vaccination levels would need to be up to 80 or 90% before he would be comfortable with any change.
One of the things I've been surprised about talking to patients about the COVID vaccine is when I mention to them that once we open the borders, COVID will come into the country, and for those of us that are not protected, you will be at risk. They're actually very surprised to hear that COVID will enter when the borders open. I think because we've been so successful at the elimination strategy and having no cases in New Zealand.
Dr Betty says misinformation about the vaccine is putting some people off the jab. The vaccination rates for Māori and Pacifica have dragged behind the rest of the population. Co-chair of Te Raupu Whakakaupapa Urutā, or the Māori Pandemic Group, Dr Raori McCree-Jansen, says Māori are particularly vulnerable and it is crucial they get vaccinated.
If Delta variant travels in Māori communities, it will be catastrophic. There will be deaths. So we must do this.
COVID Response Minister Chris Hipkins says Delta outbreaks have overwhelmed health systems overseas.
That's something we've avoided here in New Zealand, and we will do everything that we can to continue to avoid that in New Zealand. That's not to say that we haven't got our DHBs looking and planning for what they would do in the event that where they did see a sudden surge in COVID cases and they had to deal with that. Of course, we expect them to be doing that, but our primary focus is on making sure that that doesn't happen.
The government will respond tomorrow to Sir David Skegg's report and announce its plans around the border.
A lot of feedback from you all about wearing masks on bus, which obviously is all about our COVID response and being ready should there be another breakout of COVID. Gabrielle says, I live in Havelock North, Hawke's Bay. I'm a regular bus traveller and I can say I'm the only one on my bus trips wearing a mask, not even the driver. I agree we've got extremely slack and it needs to improve. Steph says, I definitely wear a mask on the bus and have been QR code scanning since day one of the app launch. Got my first jab yesterday at the crowded Kilburnie hub, however, and hubby and I were the only mask wearers. And this listener says, as a bus driver in Dunedin, I'm very concerned about the lack of mask wearing, especially in younger adult age groups. I recently expressed my concern to the Minister, but received a vague reply. Well, do keep your feedback coming. You can text us on 2101 or tweet us at @CheckpointRNZ. In Australia, the prospect of vaccine passports is growing as more people get immunised. A survey of the hospitality industry has seen a mixed response. Many businesses wouldn't want to require customers to show proof of being vaccinated. Here's the ABC's Gavin Coote.
With regional Victoria out of lockdown, there's a steady trickle of tourists making their way to the ski resorts in the Alpine region. It's recommended but not required that they get a negative coronavirus test within 72 hours of arriving.
Then we could be assured that they were thoroughly checked and we just did our normal check-ins with everyone's QR codes.
Lisa Logan runs a lodge at Falls Creek and is also president of the local Chamber of Commerce.
A lot of people have actually expressed how relieved they are when they come up because they know that they're coming to one of the safest places, certainly in Victoria, if not in Australia, because they know that other people are being tested and have a negative result as well.
As more people get vaccinated over the coming weeks and months, do you think there will come a time when customers would have to prove they've been vaccinated in order to visit regions like yours?
Certainly, I would encourage and support the idea of proving a vaccination so that we know that we can operate as close to normal as possible.
In parts of the Northern Hemisphere, proving you've been vaccinated is a ticket for entry to restaurants, sporting events and concerts. So are venues here willing to do the same? The industry body Restaurant and Catering Australia has just done a survey of its members. Wes Lambert is the CEO.
About 54% of respondents said that they wanted businesses to be able to mandate customers are vaccinated, and about 46.5% said that they did not want businesses to be able to mandate that customers are vaccinated. And so it's pretty split.
Wes Lambert reckons once proof of vaccination becomes a blanket requirement in other industries, it'll be much more widely accepted in his.
And certainly it's really a wait and see. There are companies like SPC that have gone out publicly, some of the airlines, and said that we are going to require our customers or our employees to be vaccinated, and that certainly will get the debate going.
Hairdressing is another industry split on the idea of a so-called vaccine passport. Sandy Chong is the head of the Australian Hairdressing Council and owns a salon in Newcastle.
We support vaccinations in the sense that it will certainly help our COVID situation in Australia. However, we also support that every individual should have the freedom to choose whether they are vaccinated or not. And it's very different to getting on a plane. When we look at our clientele, we've had our clientele for many, many years. And, we respect their opinion and we respect their needs.
The Governor of New York has finally resigned days after an inquiry confirmed he sexually harassed multiple women. Even the President had called on Andrew Cuomo to step down less than a year after his popularity was at a high due to his handling of the pandemic. CNN's MJ Lee has this report.
An upheaval in American politics. New York Governor Andrew Cuomo announcing his resignation.
The best way I can help now is if I step aside and let government get back to governing. And therefore, that's what I'll do.
The news marking a dramatic fall from grace for the three-term governor, a fixture in national politics for decades.
We're New York tough.
And hailed a hero for his response to the COVID-19 pandemic that ravaged his state.
The enemy landed in New York State. COVID launched the attack here. You unified and you rose and you overcame and you saved lives. And that was powerful in its effect. It was beautiful to see, and it was an honor to lead.
But the governor coming under siege in recent weeks, accused of sexually harassing multiple women, facing an impeachment investigation in Albany and several criminal investigations.
I've never crossed the line with anyone, but I didn't realize the extent to which the line has been redrawn. There are generational and cultural shifts that I just didn't fully appreciate. And I should have. No excuses.
Cuomo remaining defiant about the Attorney General's report released last week, detailing the women's allegations.
The report said I sexually harassed 11 women. That was the headline people heard and saw and reacted to. The reaction was outrage. It should have been. However, it was also false. This is not to say that there are not 11 women who I truly offended. There are. And for that, I deeply, deeply apologize.
Israel Adesanya is among a group of top mixed martial arts fighters demanding tougher penalties for so-called coward punches. It comes after an Auckland man was sentenced to home detention for punching MMA star Fo Vake in an unprovoked attack earlier this year. Vake's teammates say that's not good enough and harsher penalties are needed to keep people safe. Katie Doyle reports.
Fo Vake's death in May devastated his team at City Kickboxing. UFC superstar Israel Adesanya remembers him well.
He was always smiling. Everyone you hear anyone talk about Fo is a smile. He smiles with his mouth and his eyes. His beautiful smile that his daughter also has. And we won't see that smile anymore unless we go through videos or photos.
Fo Vake died in hospital after he and his brother were attacked on a night out. Just that day, he had been sparring with Adesanya.
I had a really horrible sparring with him. Horrible for me because he whooped my ass. But he made me better. He made me want to be better. He was a great friend as well.
Yesterday, one of the men involved in the attack on Mr Vake, Ofa Hemuni Folau, was sentenced to 6 months home detention after pleading guilty to 2 charges of assault with intent to injure. Neither the Crown nor the defence contended that Folau was responsible for Mr Vake's death. At a press conference today, the team from Mr Vake's gym renewed their call for tougher coward punch penalties. Here's UFC fighter Dan Hooker.
You need harsher penalties for the most severe aspects of a violent drinking culture. No one can deny that New Zealand has a violent drinking culture. I feel like that's an undeniable fact.
Israel Adesanya doesn't think current laws go far enough.
If you run behind someone and punch them, you know what you're trying to do. But there's no deterrent.
Coach Eugene Barrowman says his team have the largest platform in New Zealand and want to use it to effect useful change. He wants to make sure future generations are safe when they head into the city.
Me and Jacinda have something in common. We have small children. She has 1 child, I have a couple, and they're around the same age. And around about the same time, they're going to start to get really inquisitive. And quite a few years from now, about wanting to take themselves into the city and socialise with their friends. I'm doing everything I can to advocate some sort of change and make it safe.
His colleague Mike Angove says since Mr Vake's death, other coward punch victims have come forward. Last year, a members' bill to bring in tougher penalties for anyone throwing a coward's punch was voted down. Today, Mr Angove said the government should consider a law change.
Let's now have that conversation. Let's make sure that the coward punch is known as what it is, which is a cowardly, despicable act. Let's now put the deterrent in place, both with what we're talking about in the community and what we're doing in the judiciary.
3 other men, including one charged with manslaughter, are due to go to trial next year.
Well, a lot of you are still getting in touch about Delta and a potential outbreak, and also masks on buses. Let's start with masks. I'm a mask-wearing and scanning nerd, says Chris from Christchurch. However, I see few wearing masks on public transport, including an absence on bus drivers. Also, barely 10% scanning. Observed same when visiting Wellington. Incredibly disappointing to see so little support from the community to support our ongoing response. Another listener says, we're caught in a bind. We are expected to encourage mask wearing, but we are powerless to enforce it. It's a joke. Another person says, we've just come back from 2 days in Wellington. I guess I saw 5 people QR code scanning. What? We went by bus and train. I take a guess that 20% of passengers wore masks. New Zealand is in a fantastic position, but the complacency is very worrying. It will come back to bite us sooner or later. Another person says, used the bus in Christchurch twice today. I usually cycle and didn't wear a mask as I was unsure. Bus driver didn't have one either.
RNZ News at 6 o'clock. Good evening, I'm Anna Thomas. The government says the virulent Delta strain of COVID-19 will overwhelm the contact tracing system, prompting the move to escalate straight to alert level 4 lockdowns should cases emerge in the community. COVID Response Minister Chris Hipkins has told Checkpoint a maximum of several hundred COVID cases can be traced a day. He says it's learnt the lesson from states in Australia that rapidly going into lockdown is the most effective way to contain the virus.
What we saw in New South Wales was at the beginning of the outbreak, contact tracing just couldn't keep up. It couldn't get ahead of it. What we know is if you can do a short, sharp lockdown at the beginning, it gives your contact tracers time to get ahead of it, and then that system can work very, very well. And other Australian states have shown that.
Chris Hipkins says the government wants people to know what to expect if community cases are found. And the government is expected to announce tomorrow an extension of the time between COVID-19 vaccinations to 8 weeks. Mr Hipkins has told Checkpoint there is emerging evidence that maximum protection from vaccination can be enhanced with a slightly larger gap between doses. He says the government still wants to get people fully vaccinated as quickly as it can. An energy consultant says Monday night's power cut highlights a lack of accountability in the energy sector. Thousands of people in the central North Island were left without electricity on one of the coldest nights of the year. Their power was intentionally cut to reduce strain on the system. Consultant Greg Hunt says Genesis Energy is denying criticisms from the Energy Minister about the decision not to turn on its third generator. Meanwhile, Transpower says it can only instruct the industry to respond once there is an emergency. He says that leaves him wondering who is accountable. Mr Hunt says the government should consider whether there are enough incentives in the market to build more renewable generation. A coach at an Auckland mixed martial arts gym wants tougher penalties for coward punches. Hipkins was sentenced to 6 months home detention yesterday on 2 charges of assault with intent to injure. He punched MMA fighter Vake, who died 9 days later in hospital. Eugene Barrowman from City Kickboxing, where Vake trained, says he wants the city to be a safe place for his children.
Me and Jacinda have something in common. She has 1 child, I have a couple, and they're around the same age. And around about the same time, they're going to start to get really inquisitive. And quite a few years from now, about wanting to take themselves into the city and socialise with their friends.
Eugene Barrowman says he'll do everything he can to make it safe for his children. 3 others are due to go to trial next year, including 1 charged with manslaughter. Winston Churchill's New Zealand namesake says he can't believe the Greens are being so petty after they had a painting of the former British Prime Minister moved from a wall outside their parliamentary offices. Nationals called the move outrageous. The Greens are defending the move, saying they just wanted another piece more appropriate to their kaupapa. But New Zealand First Leader Winston Peters is highly critical.
I cannot believe that a group of people could be so petty, so unparliamentary, or so lacking in historic understanding of Winston Churchill's importance to, dare I say, democracy and freedom. I think they should just grow up.
New Zealand First Leader Winston Peters. A report into the health of the Waikato River says despite many actions to improve water quality, it's still deteriorating. The Waikato River Authority has delivered its report on the effectiveness and progress being made to restore the catchment. NIWA found that while 25% of river health indicators were improving, 45% were not. And for the rest, it was difficult to tell. Its Freshwater and Estuaries Centre Manager Neil Hudson says improvements take time. The Speaker of the House and longtime Hurricanes fan Trevor Mallard is vowing not to attend another game until Troy Bowker leaves the board. The businessman has reacted angrily on Twitter to Sir Ian Taylor reposting a cartoon celebrating New Zealand's success on the water at the Olympics. He accused Sir Ian of, quote, sucking up to the left-loving Maori agenda on a LinkedIn post. Mr Mallard said Mr Bowker is a major source of embarrassment to the Hurricanes. Hurricanes Rugby says it can't control the views of Mr Bowker, who is one of its part owners. It's coming up to 6:05. To sport now, and the former New Zealand cricketer Chris Cairns is now in a serious but stable condition in a Sydney hospital with a major heart problem. St Vincent's Hospital says the 51-year-old was transferred there yesterday and remains in intensive care. Cairns' wife Melanie said in a statement that it was an upsetting and concerning situation and thanked the public for their prayers and kind words. After retiring from cricket, Cairns denied match-fixing allegations and won a libel case against former Indian Premier League chairman Lalit Modi in 2012. In 2015, he was cleared of perjury in relation to the libel case after being charged by Britain's Crown Prosecution Service. He hasn't quite labelled the first test as dumb rugby, but All Blacks halfback Brad Weber knows the team needs to be much smarter when it comes to giving away penalties in Saturday's second Bledisloe Cup test in Auckland. The All Blacks conceded 18 penalties in the 30-25 win over the Wallabies, and were fortunate Australia's Noah Loisio had an off day with his kicking. Weber says they need to take the referee out of the game.
The players being smarter on what stuff they want to have a crack at, so the referee doesn't have to pull his whistle. I'm sure he doesn't want to use it that many times as well, but he's probably been forced to.
Andy Murray has been added to the US Tennis Open main draw after Swiss former champ Stan Wawrinka withdrew. Murray, who won his first Grand Slam title at the tournament in 2012, withdrew from the men's singles at the Tokyo Olympics with a thigh strain. And that's the news.
Tonight on Nights, Nick Tipping celebrates the 100th birthday of jazz guitarist Herb Ellis. We've got the winner of the New Zealand Book Awards for Children and Young Adults due just after the judges announce the final result. And speaking of young adults, this week's Hump Prize is The Healthy Kiwi Student, a food and lifestyle guide from Ellery and Sophie Martin. It's all on nights with me, Brian Crump, from after the news at 7 on RNZ National.
And now the short forecast from Met Service until midnight tomorrow. From Northland to Taranaki, also the Coromandel and the Central High Country. Partly cloudy with isolated showers. Bay of Plenty in Gisborne to Wairarapa, generally fine, but isolated showers. Whanganui to Wellington, mainly fine. However, the odd shower about Whanganui and Manawatu tomorrow, spreading elsewhere in the evening. Nelson, Marlborough and Canterbury becoming cloudy tomorrow with heavy rain about the main divide and scattered falls elsewhere from the evening, and northwest gales about the Canterbury High Country. For Buller and Westland, cloudy with a few showers, but heavy rain spreading north tomorrow. Otago and Southland, cloudy tomorrow with rain for a time late afternoon or evening, and northwest gales in exposed places. For Fiordland, periods of rain, heavy for a time tomorrow with northwest gales, and for the Chatham Islands, fine spells, a few showers, clearing tomorrow morning. RNZ National, it is 8 minutes past 6, and you're listening to Checkpoint with Lisa Owen.
Ngā mihi, Anna. No mai hoki mai, the company operating the COVID-struck ship Rio de la Plata admits it doesn't routinely test its crews for the virus. 11 of the 21 crew tested positive after arriving at the port of Tauranga. It's believed they were infected by a pilot with the Delta strain who boarded the freighter in Queensland. After several flip-flops from New Zealand government agencies, the ship docked. Unloading started, stopped and restarted and then stopped again before more than 70 port workers were eventually forced to isolate and get tested for the virus. The ship has since departed for Malaysia, abandoning plans to call into Napier and unload and reload cargo to avoid anchoring offshore until all the crew tested negative. Maersk contracts the freighter. Its head of Oceania market is Therese Blank.
We have had our crew undergo medical evaluation by the captain and the Maersk company doctor, and all of our crew members have been found to be in good health, and none of them are symptomatic. The test shows IgG positive and IgM negative, and that means that they are all past the acute phase of COVID-19 infection.
You're talking about the 11 people who are positive here, right? There are still other members of the crew who have not contracted COVID. So how are you keeping them separate and safe?
Yes, so on board the vessel, we are following the guidance from the health authorities, and they are separated to make sure that should there be any risk for spread, that is them not spreading to the crew that are not positive. So we are separating the crew members. We are applying social distancing, etc., on board the vessel to make sure that we follow and comply with all safe and healthy standards. For us as Maersk, the health and safety of our people is the most important for us when we manage this kind of incidents.
And when you say the Maersk doctor evaluated the crew, how did they do that? Was that just on a phone call?
So the Maersk doctor received all of the test results and is the one that assessed the risks. Then the conversation is between the captain and each of the crew members on a one-by-one basis to make sure and have an interview to make sure that our staff don't display any symptoms, that hasn't developed over the time this incident has taken place. And then we also talk to our crew to confirm that they feel comfortable and safe to proceed to sail the vessel. As we have reported both in our customer advisory and to the health authorities and the New Zealand and Australian government, after we got the approvals from the Ministry of Health and the New Zealand Port Authority, the vessel left its anchorage position and sailed from Tauranga late last night and is en route to Malaysia in Tanjung Pelatas.
Why is it going to Malaysia? It was due to go to Napier. Why the change in plans?
Yes, so the schedule change and decision to bypass Napier was taken after the evaluation of the well-being of the crew, as I mentioned, but also to minimize the disruption to our network. In order to enable a port call at ports of Napier, we would have had to have the vessel sit at anchorage point until all crew returned a negative test. and that would cause significant disruption and delay to our vessel schedule. We have reported there over the last 12 months about the significant disruption in the global and the New Zealand supply chain. So we need to make sure that we minimize the impact to our network and to the cargo.
What were you going to Napier for, though, Mee? Were they picking something up or dropping it off? Because obviously you're not doing that anymore.
Yes, that's a very good question. So the scheduled rotation for the Rio de la Plata was Sydney, Tauranga, Napier, Tanjung Pelapas, Singapore. So now when we are bypassing Napier, we only call Tauranga in New Zealand before sailing to Malaysia and Tanjung Pelapas. This means that the cargo that was due to be discharged in Napier has been retained on board, and it's still on board the vessel. So that cargo will be delayed back into New Zealand.
What happens to that, Mee? If you were supposed to offload that cargo and it's still on the ship, which is heading to Malaysia, how is it going to get to New Zealand, and how long will that be delayed?
Yeah, that will come on the round trip back. So the vessel will come back down to Australia and New Zealand after calling Tanjung Pelapas and Singapore. So the expected delay should be around 30 days. The export cargo that were due to load in Napier will be loaded on the next available vessel. We are currently working on the contingency plan and inducement into Napier. So we will have another vessel covering the vessel position of Rio de la Plata in Napier to make sure that we accommodate the export cargo demand out of Napier as a result of this incident.
I understand that there are only 2 of the 21 crew on board vaccinated. Why is that?
So from a Maersk perspective, we do not have any specific requirement for our crew to be vaccinated. Of course, it's something that we highly encourage, and we are also working with government across the world to make sure that we run vaccination programs for our seafarers. So in this case, we do not determine if their crew members do complete the vaccination or not, but again, it's something that we encourage.
When did you first know that the ship, Rio de la Plata, had contact with a COVID positive person? When did you know that?
We received the information on Saturday, so 4 days ago now, that the pilot that went on board the ship to ensure safe passage to Torres Strait on the southbound voyage from Southeast Asia down to Sydney had been tested positive. And this is again showing the importance of the contact tracers to make sure that as quickly as possible we are able to track any impact to our seafarers and the global community.
How often do you test the crews? When would this crew have last been tested?
Yeah, so the crew get tested before they onboard the ship. Normally, they will fly in to the location where they board the vessel. They will perform quarantine in line with the legislation in the country where they board, and they will return a negative COVID test before boarding the vessel. Then during the seafarers' time on board the vessel, they will not take COVID test unless they have any symptoms. So as soon as one of the seafarers shows symptoms, then they will be asked to perform a COVID test and isolate.
So there's no regular testing regime. For example, when other people come on board the ship, you don't regularly test to make sure that nobody has contracted COVID as a result of people loading and unloading your ships.
No, so we do not do regular testing. Again, we only do testing in case of any concerns, like such as this case, or if any of the crew members were to display any symptoms. And again, we are following the legislation, the global legislation, but also the legislation and the local authorities' guidance in each of the countries that the vessel calls.
Do you think that you're making a mistake there and that maybe you need to change the regime?
Again, as I said, we will continue to follow the law and the regulation and also the recommendation from the health authorities. So, of course, should that change and should the recommendation from the health authorities change and new policies be put in place, then, of course, we will comply with that. But similar to the vaccination, it will remain on voluntarily basis for now until such case that the health advice changes.
And that is me, Therese Blank from Maersk. And Maersk has since got back to us to clarify and say that they were informed on the 3rd of August that the ship had contact with a positive COVID case, not the 7th. So they say they heard on the 3rd of August, which is when New Zealand authorities say they were also notified. It is 17 minutes past 6 and you're with Checkpoint on RNZ National. Brace yourself. The government's warning it will take a swift and severe approach to any future cases of COVID-19 and move quickly to alert level 4. It comes as a long-awaited report into reopening our border warns New Zealand is likely to experience an outbreak of Delta variant similar to Sydney's. Delta has also disrupted plans to ease restrictions, dashing hopes returning New Zealanders could avoid managed isolation if they're fully vaccinated. Here's political reporter Katie Scotcher.
The Delta variant of COVID-19 is wreaking havoc across the globe. Just across the ditch in Sydney, more than 300 community cases were reported today. And Prime Minister Jacinda Ardern's well aware of the risk that poses to New Zealand.
We are concerned about how much more transmissible it is.
The government's so concerned, COVID-19 Response Minister Chris Hipkins today issued this warning.
So my message to all New Zealanders is that this is not over, that we are still going to be dealing with COVID-19 for a while yet. Further lockdowns are possible. If they were to happen, they would happen as they did previously with very short notice. And everybody should have a plan for what they would do in those circumstances.
If a case of the Delta variant is found in the community, it'll be straight to alert level 4.
I guess what I wanted to foreshadow today is that it's certainly more likely that our response is likely to be swift and severe in the event that we were to see a case emerge in the community.
The Delta variant has changed plans for border restrictions too. A long-awaited report has examined how New Zealand can reconnect with the world. The advice initially suggested fully vaccinated New Zealanders returning from a short overseas trip could enter the country without having to go through MIQ, while other travellers could stay in managed isolation for a shorter period or quarantine at home. But in response to the more dangerous variant, the report's authors have essentially scrapped that plan and are now recommending the border is opened in phases once the vaccination rollout is complete. But they say it's still too soon to say how exactly that should happen, as it depends on the state of the pandemic at the time and how the vaccines are responding to new variants of the virus. It's not the roadmap back to normality many had hoped for.
As soon as we can provide more certainty, of course we will look to do that. Tomorrow what you'll see is the Prime Minister will set out some of our thinking, some of the markers along the road that people can expect to see, but it's not a definite blueprint with milestones and timelines, because there's still so much that we don't know.
Look, this so-called open and transparent government is actually taking the piss out of the New Zealand people.
Ex-leader David Seymour wants certainty. He says border restrictions need to begin easing at the start of next year, even if rates of vaccination aren't high enough.
If we can't have risk proportional safe reopening with antigen testing, with rapid testing, with good contact tracing and isolation, if all of that requires vaccination, if vaccination doesn't work, then we're isolated forever. So clearly we have to have a plan B.
National leader Judith Collins says the vaccine rollout is the key to opening up the country as quickly as possible.
Certainly think that the answer to all of our issues around COVID will have to come down to vaccinate.
Two more countries, Fiji and Indonesia, were designated high risk today, showing just how tricky this pandemic is. Just a few months ago in March, there were talks about opening a bubble with Fiji. The Pacific nation is now reporting hundreds of new infections every day. From midnight on Sunday, the only people who can travel from these countries are New Zealand citizens, their partners and dependent children, or the parents of young New Zealanders. What a difference a few months make.
A lot of feedback on this one. Richard's got in touch to say, how come the government can lock us all down when they wish, yet will not make it mandatory to get those that need to be vaccinated to keep us all safe? Come on, government, step up your game, says Richard. Brian reckons scanning of QR codes must be mandatory. The government was told about 8 to 10 weeks was the preferred space between vaccines months ago, this listener says, and it came from UK epidemiologists who had the scientific evidence. Our government is very slow to move on this evidence. Dorothy's got in touch to say New Zealand is where it is with COVID, primarily through good luck. If we escape a Delta outbreak, it'll be a bloody miracle, says Dorothy. Still, I'm ready for level 4. I've already stocked up on toilet paper. Sarah says, granted, MOH has had its hands full with managing COVID this year, but in March last year, we learned that our supply of ICU beds was woefully low. So it's distressing to hear experts assert today that they are still woefully low. One might have hoped that some extra capacity had been added in the past 16 months. Unimpressed, signs off Sarah. The government is putting $24.1 million of further funding towards Maori trades and training and reducing barriers to employment for rangatahi. Social Development and Employment Minister Carmel Sepuloni announced this in Porirua this morning. The fund will support over 500 Maori job seekers into employment and training opportunities. Matai O'Connor reports.
Right in the heart of Porirua sits Whitireia Community Polytech, where learning, education, skills and training are at the fingertips of many in the rohe. Today, the government announced $24.1 million to go towards Māori trades and training. One of those welcoming the putia is aspiring tradesman George Firminus. Born on his whenua at Ngāti Toa, for the last 2 months he has been working towards his apprenticeship while undergoing a trades and training program, Mahi Toa, through the iwi. George says it means a lot to have access to an apprenticeship and work experience and to be supported by his own iwi.
For the iwi, it's a good family-based way of like how we can know each other and be supportive with each other and everything, so that, you know, when I make mistakes, they'll be able to lift me up back on my feet.
The money will go towards partnerships between local iwi and government to tackle the barriers being faced by young people struggling to get a foot in the employment door. Bianca Alkington is the General Manager for Education and Employment at Te Runanga o Toa Rangatira. She says the extra funding means the iwi can continue to do good work within career development and trades training for their people. And more support will reach more rangatahi.
For me, I look back and think, in education and employment, our people, when they have the support in all different areas, they can just fly, and that's what I've seen, and that's what today's announcement will enable us to do more of.
The government has shifted its focus towards urban communities after seeing the demand for support in these areas. It wants to give assurance to Māori that there are opportunities for them where there are workforce shortages. Minister for Social Development Carmel Sepuloni says Māori and Pacific people are most at risk in an economic crisis due to the lack of access in the past to employment and education opportunities. She says it's time to shift the focus.
We have not had access to the upskilling and training and educational opportunities that perhaps others have. And then when we have an economic crisis, then often Māori and Pacific are the most disadvantaged in the labour market. And so we've got to shift that.
Ms Alkington says Māori are innovators, but there's always a need for more funding.
Oh, there's always a lot of work to do, always. I don't think it's ever enough, but what I do think that Māori often, we're innovators. So we take the funding and we get to the results that far exceed what government would think we could achieve.
More than 18 million from the government's boost in funding for job seekers in urban communities will be for 13 projects under the Māori Trades and Training Fund. A further 5 million will go towards 10 projects through the He Potama Rangatahi program in hopes of eliminating the barriers for Māori communities and limiting unemployment.
Abbey Road may be the name of a legendary Beatles album, but it's also a recording studio, chocker with history in London. Some of the greatest pop songs and film scores have been recorded at the studio, which is opening to the public in celebration of its 90th birthday. The BBC's Victoria Hollins has more.
Think of a Hollywood blockbuster and there's a good chance its music was recorded here, Studio One at Abbey Road. The world's largest recording space and control room is on rare show as part of Abbey Road's open house.
One of my favourite memories is standing up on that balcony up there and seeing a full concert orchestra playing, and it's right in your belly. It's absolutely amazing.
Isabel Garvey and her team cleared the studio's diary for the week of tours, a challenge because it's usually booked years ahead.
You never get complacent about walking up those steps every morning, coming through those doors, and you can kind of feel what's happened before you. And musicians and artists that come through here often talk about that they feel the pressure to do their best work because of who's come before them.
Abbey Road was officially opened in 1931 by Edward Elgar as a classical music studio, but as it expanded, it began attracting musicians from all around the world. Studio 2, perhaps the most famous of the Abbey Road studios, and that's partly because it's where the Beatles recorded the majority of their music, and it's still hugely in demand today, but the real star of the show sits in the corner. The original Mrs. Mills piano, made famous in the 60s and used by the Beatles. It's among hundreds of items, including recording consoles and instruments that have shaped music history.
Strawberry Fields Forever, Take 7, remix from 4-track.
Visitors also get to hear the Fab Four between takes in the studio.
I think that was rather grand. I'd take one home with me.
Sadly for fans, the open house week is a one-off, making it all the more special.
It's been a dream come true, really. Studio 2 has got to be the heart of it, really, and visualising the Beatles there.
To be here on the hallowed ground where all of those amazing sounds were created is just spine-tingling.
There are 90 years of stories in these walls, but Abbey Road's iconic status means there'll be many more secrets that may never be told.
More from you on a potential lockdown and masks on buses. This person says Seymour's policy of opening the borders on a fixed date, regardless of the situation, is irrational. No business behaves like that. Fortunately, he will not have a say in when the borders are opened, that listener says. On masks on buses, and well, it looks like a few people are not bothering to wear them. This person says just asked a train inspector why he didn't seem to care if people didn't wear masks. He has no authority to tell people, only the police, and they need some police to do that, this person says. And this one, I'm a daily bus commuter in Auckland. I'm happy to report a very high level of mask compliance on the services I use to and from the North Shore. Interesting. We're almost out of time. Ko te kaupapa tuatahi a pōpō on First Up from 5 o'clock tomorrow morning, that is. They'll be asking the Deputy Prime Minister Grant Robertson what a short, sharp Delta lockdown would look like. Kaua e wari te atatero I a mato kōrero. Don't forget you can check out all our stories and videos online. Kei te hoki mai anō pōpō whānau pō Māori.
NZ News headlines at 6:30. The COVID-19 response minister says lessons can be learned from Australia's response to the Delta virus as the government promises swift and severe action to any outbreak here. The time between the two COVID-19 vaccinations is expected to increase to 8 weeks. Mixed martial arts coach Eugene Barrowman is joining the call for tough penalties for coward punches, saying he wants safer cities for his children. More than $24 million of further funding will go towards Māori trades and training. Those are the headlines. Our next news and weather is at 7.
This week on Champions of the Pacific, we speak to a Fijian trailblazer in women's sport
And a Paralympic shot putter reveals how sport changed his life for the better. Check us out at rnz.co.nz under the Pacific tab, or download us wherever you get your podcasts. Or listen in to Champions of the Pacific, Wednesday nights at 9:40 on RNZ National.
And I'm Brian Crump, getting ready for another night on RNZ National, which will include Champions of the Pacific this evening at around about 20 minutes to 10. Also on the program, after 7, Timothy Welch. He's from the School of Architecture and Planning at Auckland University, on the vexed topic of whether scooters, as in e-scooters, should be allowed to ride on the footpath, which is where most people who use them ride them. Now there's a move by Living Streets Aotearoa, which was a pedestrian lobby group, to ban them from footpaths, because so are bicycles and e-bikes at the moment. Legally, you're not supposed to ride your bike on the footpath unless you're the postie. Timothy will talk about that after the news at 7. Welcome your thoughts.